Hello, thank you for attending the Technical Assistance for Diversity Plan Report Writing webinar. I am Dr. Dawn Offit, the Director of Initiatives for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at the Kentucky Council on Post-Secondary Education, otherwise known as CPE. This particular webinar is intended for those individuals that have any input towards writing the annual institutional diversity evaluation reports. Today's objectives will be to define key terms for crafting any strategy revisions, to discuss reviewer expectations for analyzing for effectiveness, to provide examples of responses that would receive a score of a 0, 1, and 2, as well as the reasons why one might receive the score of a 0, 1, or 2. And then finally, I will provide some tips for actually writing the report. So let's get started by defining key terms. We wanted to make sure that we define key terms so that everyone is on the same page. Oftentimes, words get used interchangeably, or one assumes that someone on the receiving end of the message defines a particular word the same way that you do. So in order to try to cut down on any confusion, we want to make sure that we define terms. So for this particular report writing webinar, we want to look at the word goal. And so goals are your big ideas, the big idea that you want to accomplish. Goals are broad in their statements, and they are generally supported by measurable objectives. So an example of a goal would be to raise the percentage of Kentuckians with a high quality post-secondary degree or certificate. An objective, then, is what is needed to achieve the goals. It represents the specific outcomes. And more importantly, objectives are measurable. So an example would be to increase the participation in post-secondary education for traditionally underserved populations annually by 5%. You'll see that annually by 5% is in bold, and that is intended to indicate that this is something that is measurable. So for the purpose of this report writing and our discussion, we use goals and objectives in combination with one another. So you'll see that goals, as we look at the word goals and what we're doing, it encompasses those measurable characteristics that we just defined in terms of the word objective. So an example of this would be to increase the enrollment rates of underrepresented minority and low-income students by 3% over the next 5 years. So your goal is there because it represents your big idea, but it still has that measurable component of an objective. So again, for our intents and purposes, when we're looking at the word goal, the goal has the measurable characteristics of objectives included in its definition. So strategies. Your strategy is your overall approach for reaching and obtaining that objective. And ultimately, as it rolls up, it leads to attaining your goal. So in a sense, your strategies should answer the question, how do we accomplish our goals? They are a general approach or method, whereas a tactic or an action step is more specific. So an example of a strategy is to coordinate a statewide communication strategy aimed at underrepresented minorities and students from low-income families that raises awareness of the value and affordability of a post-secondary degree. As stated previously, your tactics or your action steps are your specific activities that help to accomplish and meet your objectives. They are actionable. So an example of a tactic or an action step is to create a public service announcement to be played in markets across the state with a high percentage of families that are low income. Now let's look at all three of those terms, going from the most broad to the more specific. If you have a goal, and your goal is to increase the enrollment rates of underrepresented minority and low-income students by 3% over the next 5 years, then your strategy that you're going to use to accomplish that goal is to coordinate a statewide communication strategy aimed at underrepresented minorities and students from low-income families that raises awareness of the value and affordability of a post-secondary degree. And then your specific action step or your tactic is to create a public service announcement to be played in markets across the state with a high percentage of families that are low income. So for this particular exercise, when institutions are preparing to write their evaluation, they are writing their evaluation based on the strategies that they used for the preceding academic year. So you're not writing about goals, you're not writing about tactics, you're writing about and ultimately being scored and evaluated on how you reported out on the strategies that you used. So now we're going to get into a little bit more specifics in terms of the actual report writing and give an example of what review teams might be looking for when they go to score your report. So we're going to start with the analyzing for effectiveness component of the report. So before we begin to think about how we evaluate the strategies, let's take a step back and take a look at the big picture of the diversity, equity, and inclusion report. So each institution's strategies are presented in 3 sections. As you know, opportunity, success, and impact. And for each one of those strategies, opportunity, success, and impact, there are 3 questions that are asked that you must answer. 1, how did you implement that strategy with fidelity? 2, how did you analyze that strategy for effectiveness? And 3, what are your lessons learned and next steps? So for each one of the strategies, you will be responding to those 3 questions. So for the purposes of this training, we'll look at impact. We know that opportunity refers to recruiting and enrolling a diverse student body. Student success is that measure of getting students from first to second year as well as to completion. And then impact discusses and describes the campus climate, how inclusive it is, and the level of cultural competency. For this particular example that we're going to use, we're going to be housed in the impact section. So in your tool that you use and in your actual diversity plan, impact is defined as follows. To fully realize the positive impacts of diversity, Kentucky's public institutions must provide an inclusive and supportive environment for its diverse group of students. In order to live and thrive in a diverse campus and in an increasingly diverse world, students must become more culturally competent. Faculty and staff should also be more culturally competent in order to help the diverse student population thrive and succeed. There are three important entities noted in this description. They're underlined and bolded. Kentucky's public institutions, students, and faculty and staff. So your leadership at your public institutions are tasked with providing an inclusive, supportive environment, and also with developing cultural competency for students, faculty, and staff. So we'll be looking at an example of a strategy housed in this impact section, and we'll talk about how one might receive the score of a 0, a 1, or a 2 when you're analyzing for effectiveness. So what is looked for when we're talking about analyzing for effectiveness? Again, the description and definition is presented in front of you. And it reads as such: the institution shall provide an analysis of the effectiveness of each strategy with a sufficient level of detail. It is a strategy, if a strategy was not fully implemented or not implemented at all, a thorough analysis and justifiable explanation of why this did not occur shall be provided. If you look to see where we have the bolded and underlined sections, we'll note two things. In this particular description, one of the things that jumps out is to provide an analysis of the effectiveness in a sufficient level of detail. And two, if the strategy did not occur, a thorough analysis and justifiable explanation of why this did not occur shall be provided. So in your rubric, in sum, it's important for those that are submitting their strategies to ensure that they have correctly identified which three areas the particular strategy belongs in, and that all three components are fully addressed and addressed appropriately. So when you are having your strategy evaluated, you could receive a score of a 0, a 1, or a 2. A 0 meaning that it does not meet expectations. A 1 meaning that you're making progress toward meeting expectations. Or 2, that you have met or exceeded the expectations. So let's look at an example. Well, before we get to the example, let's delve a little bit more into what it means to receive a 0. Because if you have written something, you want to understand why you did not receive any points for that. You would not receive any points if you're looking at the definition and it says the institution's analysis of the strategy fails to provide any substantive value. You see that point underlined. Or that the strategies that were described as being not fully implemented are not fully addressed. That's how you would get a 0. Because if you look at the definition of analysis, an analysis is a detailed examination of anything complex in order to understand its nature or to determine its essential features. In short, it's a thorough study. So, based on the definition, the response must have a detailed examination. So the response does require an analysis that applies all three scores. And if the strategy was not fully implemented, you must also address why this was the case. The score's determining factor, then, is the quality of the response of the analysis. And I'll say that again. The score's determining factor is the quality of the response of the analysis. So how do you get a 1? Well, you would get a 1 indicating that you're making progress toward meeting expectations if you have provided an analysis at a basic level. So you've gone from not providing an analysis to providing one at a basic level. And then how would you get a 2? By providing a full and thorough analysis and being sure that this analysis is in accordance with the assessment plan that's outlined in your overall institutional diversity plan. Your analysis must be thorough and have a justifiable explanation if your strategy was not implemented at all. So that's how you would get a 2. So here's where we're looking at your example. So let's say our example strategy is to promote the importance of cultural competence by hosting various speakers and workshops related to this topic. That's our strategy. So here is how we gave an example of how we are reporting out on how we did in the previous year. The campus diversity team planned many successful events this year. One event that we planned to have was a campus speaker. The campus diversity team was not able to get a speaker until the very end of the year, which was at the same time as finals. Therefore, there were few students in attendance, but we will try again next year. So the strategy has an analysis of sorts, but it's hard to find any substantive value in it. At best, you could say that the number of students attending the event is some sort of analysis for the event, but without any discussion of established purposes for the event or a predetermined desired outcome, it's hard even to say that there's any substantive value to this particular description. So in order to look at how a review team might go about scoring this particular description, here are 6 sample questions. Now, I'm not saying that you would use these questions for every strategy that someone is trying to evaluate, but these provide a good example for you. So these are the ones we're going to use just to kind of go over this particular discussion. So if we ask the questions, what was the purpose of the event? How was it linked to the strategy? What was the speaker's topic? Was it diversity? How many students were in attendance? Did the event reach the target audience? And if so, by what percentage? And how do you know the students learned? As previously noted, there was very little information and what we consider to be no substantive value in the responses. But how many of these questions could be answered? And based on what was written earlier, really only one could be answered, and that was how many students were in attendance. And that was very vague because the response said few. So looking at this would be an example of how one might receive a score of a 0 because it does not really provide any substantive value. So for example, number 2 of the analysis, the campus diversity team planned and facilitated a one-time event by having an external diversity expert speaker come to campus during new student orientation. While publicizing the event could have gone better, student attendance was pretty good. There were between 340 and 350 new students in attendance. The faculty representative on the campus diversity team said she heard 3 students talking about the event and 2 staff reported hearing positive feedback from students. Overall, we feel good about this event. Staff and faculty will be invited to attend next year too. So the strategy has this analysis of sorts, and maybe it's certain that the strategy in and of itself was actually implemented. So you're still looking to see the question about substantive value, and are you able to answer those 6 questions that we presented a few moments ago? What was the purpose of the event? Well, we know that it was a diversity event, which means that it does actually fit in the strategy located under the impact section. How was it linked to the strategy? Maybe not so much. What was the specific diversity topic? Not so much. But how many students were in attendance? We went from few to 340 to 350. Did the event reach the target audience? It described how these individuals were new students, but doesn't give us a percentage. And how do you know the students learned? Well, there was some anecdotal feedback from what faculty overheard students saying. So here, all in all, there was some analysis, but again, this would be considered analysis at a basic level, and it would receive the score of a 1. Now, let's look at the third example. A campus survey showed campus climate was the greatest diversity need. Thus, the following strategy was planned with the purpose of improving campus climate. The strategy was assessed using a pre-test, post-test for participants and qualitative data collected from social media and a focus group. Campus leadership invited a high-qualified national speaker to lead a one-time campus-wide interactive 2-hour program for students, staff, and faculty regarding campus climate. The event was publicized through print and social media outlets. At the beginning of the program, participants were given a 10-question pretest using Poll Anywhere to measure their cultural competency. The same test was given at the end of the program. Correct responses increased between 15 and 38 percentage points. Since the event targeted traditional students, staff, and faculty, records show that 68% of traditional students, 44% of staff, and 51% of faculty attended. Participants were encouraged to provide feedback via social media during and after the program, and a student, staff, and faculty small focus group interview a week later. The social media and focus group feedback provided qualitative data that revealed specific trends in campus climate concerns and opportunities for improvement, which was used to inform the lessons learned and next steps. So let's go back to our 6 questions that we were using to gauge how the quality of the actual response fared. Do we have an answer for what was the speaker's topic? To improve campus climate, which was the speaker's topic, and there was evidence it was linked to the strategy. Did the event reach the target audience? And if so, what percentage? And you'll see the percentages listed before you. And how do you know the students learned? Because there were pre-test and post-test scores, as well as responses reviewed from social media and a focus group. So one of the things that you'll note is that there was a lot more description, a lot more in-depth, thorough analysis as to this particular strategy and the accompanying action step that helped to support that particular strategy. So what we want to make sure that you're getting from this is that the analysis of strategy is just as important as the strategy itself, as well as what is learned from implementing that strategy. The analysis planning should be part of planning the strategy itself. And then when you're writing, you also want to include the fact that your analysis should inform your lessons learned and next steps. Because if you don't do a thorough analysis of your lessons learned, of your particular strategy, of the effectiveness, then the review teams and the reviewers might question if your lessons learned and next steps are actually valid because they actually are connected. So with that in mind, what we want to make sure that we do is to offer some tips for report writing. And so this is not to insult anyone's intelligence. I know that a lot of individuals that will be watching this will have written on numerous articles and dissertations and grants and the like. We just want to make sure that we are giving you some tips based on the feedback from previous review teams for what they will be looking for in an effort for all of us to be as close to being on the same page as possible. So as we started this beginning discussion and talking about strategies, we want to make sure that strategies are actually strategies and not objectives or action steps, because the review teams will be trained on how to evaluate a strategy. And it's very difficult for them to try to give any score if you don't have a strategy, if you have an action step or an objective that you're asking them to evaluate as a strategy. So an example would be to increase URM enrollment from area high schools. That's not a strategy, but to provide more opportunities for URM high school juniors or seniors to attend on-campus recruitment events. You want to ensure your proposed strategies are targeted, specific, and support the overall goal and objective. And what that means is, we talked about the fact that the diversity reports and the plans in and of themselves are divided into 3 categories: opportunity, success, and impact. So what you'll want to make sure is that your strategy that you're reporting on actually should be aligned under the particular category, either opportunity, success, or impact. So if we're looking at this particular diversity report evaluation plan, and you are trying to have a strategy that says to improve support services for students, this particular diversity plan report evaluation in writing is geared toward your underrepresented minority students. So you want to be specific to note that this is our target audience. You want to be sure that you answer the question in its entirety. It is reminiscent of writing for an essay when we had to do those kinds of things in the dark ages for your middle school and high school. And you were given an essay question, and the teacher always said, be sure to answer all parts of the question. The same would be here. You have a rubric that you would want to use, and the rubric gives you multiple components to address. And so as you're writing, you want to be sure that you're referring back to the rubric on several occasions to ensure that you have answered any and all parts of the question. Your claim must be backed up by data when you are analyzing for effectiveness. Again, the caveat to this writing is that you are writing for the previous academic year, and you would have had to input some component of analysis during your activity, your action step, your tactic that supported your strategy in an effort to now be writing about it. So as you are collecting your data and as you're preparing to write, you want to be sure that you are asking the question, how do we ensure and prepare for analysis, and collecting that data to be able to write about and in some cases submit in your actual report. Depth is better than breadth. What we're talking about here is that it's better to provide more detail about 1 or 2 activities that happen with the strategy than trying to write a little bit about 50 strategies. Go into more detail about 2, then have a little bit of detail about 50, because you really want to be able to say these are our best examples of what we did and this is why, and be able to describe them than trying to list everything that you did. The reviewers are going to get more out of the examples and details used for fewer activities than they would if you just list all the activities that you've done. Be sure to take advantages of any of the lessons learned sections because, again, they are tied to the analysis of effectiveness. So that if you, for whatever reason, were unable to perform a strategy, you want to talk about that in your analysis section and then talk about how you're going to improve upon that the next time. So just to be clear, if something happens that prevented you from being able to implement a strategy, the reviewers are not there to critique you on the fact that something happened that prevented you from writing about the strategy. They are there to see how well you talk about your lessons learned and your next steps and what was the rationale for why this didn't happen. Not that it didn't happen, but what was the rationale and the quality that you are writing about the rationale for why it didn't happen, as well as what you learned from why it didn't happen and how you're going to try to remedy that the next time. So this has been your technical assistance webinar for writing your evaluation reports. I'll pause to let you know that the reports are due March 2nd, 2020 by close of business, and that you will be hearing from us soon in terms of how to submit it in our updated tool. If you have any questions, again, I am Dawn Offutt. I can be reached at dawn.offutt, OFFUTT, @ky.gov. And I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thanks for taking the time to listen to this webinar. Happy writing!